It was a Thursday night in April, one of those nights where the air felt heavy with the promise of rain but held off just enough to keep you restless. The clock on the bedside table read 12:47 a.m., the glow of the numbers casting long shadows on the wall. I should have been asleep. David had turned in hours ago after grumbling about a long day at work, but I was still awake, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, replaying the day in my mind. The house was quiet, our sprawling suburban oasis in the heart of Charlotte, North Carolina. It was the kind of house I dreamed of when we first got married. Big enough for the family we never got around to having, with high ceilings, wide windows, and a kitchen that could rival any Food Network set. I'd hired Maria 6 months ago to help keep up with it all. She was efficient, confident, and a little too charming for my liking, but she did her job well. She had this way of lighting up a room, of making herself at home in a way that was both impressive and infuriating. David liked her immediately. Good energy, he'd said after their first meeting, smiling that easy, boyish smile that had once melted my heart. You'll like her too. I hadn't. Not really. It wasn't that she did anything wrong. She was professional, polite, and capable. But something about her lingered in the air long after she left. I couldn't put my finger on it, and for months, I told myself I was being paranoid. But hindsight is a funny thing. That night, as I lay in bed, a sound broke the silence. Laughter. At first, I thought it was the TV. David had a habit of leaving it on when he went to bed, but as I sat up and listened, I realized the sound wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the kitchen. Frowning, I slipped out of bed and pulled on my robe, the silk fabric cool against my skin. My bare feet patted softly against the hardwood floors as I moved toward the stairs, the sound of laughter growing louder with each step. It wasn't just laughter, it was her laughter. Maria's voice was unmistakable, high and melodic, the kind of laugh that made you feel like you were in on a joke. And then there was another voice, David's. I froze midway down the staircase, my heart thudding in my chest. What was she doing here this late? The laughter stopped suddenly, replaced by low murmurs. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was intimate, too familiar. I crept down the rest of the stairs, careful to avoid the spots that creaked, and stopped just outside the kitchen. Through the crack in the door, I saw them. Maria was leaning across the counter, her hand resting just inches from David's. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose bun, her face flushed with laughter. David stood across from her, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up. He looked relaxed, younger somehow, and the way he was looking at her made my stomach turn. His hand moved, closing the gap between them. "David," I said, stepping into the kitchen. The room went still, the tension so thick I could barely breathe. Maria straightened up immediately, her face draining of color. David yanked his hand away like he'd been caught touching a live wire. "Hey, honey," he said, his voice too cheerful, too rehearsed. "What are you doing up?" I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I could ask you the same thing. What's going on here?" Maria stammered something about finishing up some work, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous edge. David chimed in quickly, his voice steady but unconvincing. "She just stopped by to drop off a few things," he said. "We got to talking and, at midnight?" I cut him off, raising an eyebrow. The silence that followed was deafening. "Go home, Maria," I said finally, my voice calm but cold. Maria glanced at David, her eyes wide with something that looked like regret, or maybe fear. Then, without another word, she grabbed her purse and hurried out the door. David opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop him. "I don't want to hear it," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed anger. "Not tonight." He looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have stopped him. With a heavy sigh, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving me standing there, alone in the silence. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, David acted like nothing had happened. He kissed me on the cheek, asked about my plans for the day, and left for work as usual. Maria didn't show up, and I didn't call to ask why. By lunchtime, I'd had enough. I grabbed my phone and called her. She picked up on the third ring. "Hello?" "It's me," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through me. There was a pause. "Hi," she said cautiously. "We need to talk," I said. "Today. My house. 2 o'clock. She hesitated, but eventually, she agreed. When she arrived, she looked different. Nervous. Gone was the confident, self-assured woman I'd hired. We sat across from each other at the dining table, the air between us thick with unspoken words. "Why were you here last night?" I asked, my voice sharp. Maria glanced down at her hands, fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. "It's not what you think," she said finally. "Then tell me what it is," I demanded. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, guilt, or maybe a mix of both. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said quietly, and in that moment, I knew. Whatever she was about to say, it was going to change everything. The moment Maria said those words, "I didn't mean for this to happen," I felt my stomach drop. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground beneath you was about to give way. "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I asked, my voice cold and steady, though my hands gripped the edge of the table tightly. Maria hesitated, her gaze darting toward the window like she was contemplating running. Then, with a deep breath, she met my eyes. "It wasn't supposed to be anything," she said quietly. "At first, it was just friendly. Your husband, David, he seemed lonely." "Lonely," I repeated, my voice heavy with disbelief. "He has a wife. How does that make him lonely?" Maria flinched at the edge in my tone. "I'm not trying to make excuses," she said quickly, "but he started talking to me. About work, about you. About how things weren't the same between you two anymore." My grip on the table tightened, the wood pressing into my palms. "And what? You thought it was your job to fill the gaps?" Her cheeks flushed with shame, but she didn't look away. "No," she said. "I swear. I never planned for it to get this far. It just happened." "What exactly happened?" I demanded, my voice sharper now. Maria hesitated, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "We kissed," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit me like a slap. I felt my breath hitch, my vision blurring at the edges. "When?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Last week," she said, her gaze dropping to the table. "It was late. I'd stayed to finish some things, and it just happened. He kissed me, and I didn't stop him." My heart pounded in my chest, anger and betrayal swirling in my veins. "Didn't stop him?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Do you realize what you've done? You didn't just cross a line. You obliterated it." "I know," she said quickly, tears welling in her eyes. "I know I screwed up, but I swear, that's all it was. Just one kiss. It hasn't happened again." I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "And I'm supposed to believe that? After catching you in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, holding his hand like it's something you do all the time?" Maria stood too, her tears spilling over now. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen." Her apology felt hollow, like a flimsy attempt to absolve herself of guilt. "Get out," I said, my voice low but firm. "What?" she asked, her eyes widening. "You heard me," I said, pointing toward the door. "Get out of my house. You're done here." Maria opened her mouth to argue, but one look at my face must have told her it was useless. Without another word, she grabbed her purse and walked out the door, her sobs fading as she disappeared down the driveway. That evening, I waited for David to come home, my mind a storm of anger, hurt, and questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. When he walked through the door, his face lit up with the same easy smile he always wore, until he saw me standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, waiting. "What's going on?" he asked, his smile faltering. "You tell me," I said, my voice cold. David frowned, setting his briefcase down. "What are you talking about?" "I talked to Maria today," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "She told me everything." The color drained from his face, and he took a step back, like he'd been physically struck. "I can explain." "Don't," I snapped, cutting him off. "Don't even try to lie to me, David. She told me about the kiss. About how you've been talking to her about us." David ran a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Funny, that's exactly what she said," I replied, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "It was a mistake," he said quickly. "A stupid, impulsive mistake. It didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You kissed another woman, David. In our house. You don't get to brush that off like it's nothing." "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I screwed up, but I love you. I don't want to lose you." His words felt like a cruel joke. How could he claim to love me while betraying me in the same breath? "I don't know if I can believe that," I said, my voice trembling. David took a step closer, his eyes pleading. "Please," he said, "let me fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us." I stared at him, my heart breaking all over again. Part of me wanted to believe him, to give him another chance. But another part of me, the part that had stayed awake night after night, wondering why I wasn't enough, knew better. "I need time," I said finally, stepping back. David nodded, his expression desperate. "Take all the time you need," he said. "Just don't shut me out." I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving him standing alone in the kitchen. As I closed the bedroom door behind me, I realized that no matter how this played out, one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog, every moment heavy, every conversation charged with unspoken tension. David kept his distance, hovering around the edges of the house like a ghost, his attempts at small talk falling flat. I avoided him as much as I could, throwing myself into errands and phone calls, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the truth? There was no escaping it. Maria was gone. David's betrayal, however small he wanted to paint it, was not. I replayed every detail of her confession and our confrontation, trying to piece together the cracks in my marriage that had led to this moment. By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, real ones, not excuses or deflections. David was in the living room when I found him, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as I entered, his eyes weary but hopeful. "Do you have a minute?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "Of course," he said, setting the glass down and sitting up straighter. I took a seat across from him, clasping my hands tightly in my lap. "I need the truth, David. No more sugarcoating, no more it didn't mean anything. I want to know why." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can give you a straight answer," he admitted. "Try," I said, my voice hardening. He nodded, leaning forward. "It wasn't about you," he said finally. "I know it sounds like a cop-out, but it's true. You've been amazing, more than I deserve. It's me. I've been lost." "Lost?" I repeated, my skepticism clear. He nodded again, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Work's been rough. I've been feeling like a failure, like I'm not good enough, for my job, for this house, for you, and Maria." She listened. She didn't judge me. For a moment, it felt like I could escape all the pressure. "So what?" I asked, my voice rising. "You kissed her because it made you feel better about yourself?" David flinched at my tone, but he didn't deny it. "I wasn't thinking," he said. "It was stupid and selfish, and I hate myself for it." I stared at him, my chest tightening. "Do you even realize how much you've hurt me?" His eyes filled with tears, and he nodded. "Every day since it happened," he said, "and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of his words hanging between us. I wanted to scream at him, to throw something, to make him feel the depth of my pain. But instead, I just felt tired. "David," I said finally, my voice trembling, "I don't know if I can do this anymore." His face crumpled. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't say that. We can fix this. I'll go to therapy. I'll do anything. Just give me a chance." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I've been giving you chances, David. Every time I ignored the distance between us, every time I convinced myself that things would get better. And this was the last straw. He looked at me, desperation etched into every line of his face. I love you, he whispered. I don't doubt that, I said, my voice soft but steady. But love isn't enough. Not anymore. The next morning, I packed a bag. It wasn't an angry, dramatic exit, just a quiet act of self-preservation. David stood in the doorway as I zipped up my suitcase, his expression a mix of sadness and resignation. Where will you go? He asked. Just for a while, I said. I need time to figure things out. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. Take all the time you need, he said. As I walked out the door, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Grief for the life we'd built, relief at finally taking control of my own happiness, and a cautious hope for whatever came next. Weeks turned into months. I stayed with a friend in Raleigh for a while, her spare bedroom becoming my sanctuary as I pieced myself back together. I started therapy, took long walks, and slowly began to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. David called a few times, but I never picked up. His voicemails were heartfelt, full of promises and apologies, but I knew better than to fall into the same patterns. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old boxes, I came across a photo of us from our honeymoon. We were standing on the beach, our arms around each other, smiling like the world belonged to us. I stared at it for a long time before tucking it back into the box. It wasn't anger I felt anymore. It was acceptance. By the end of the summer, the divorce was finalized. It wasn't bitter or drawn out, just a quiet agreement to part ways. Maria, I later learned, had moved back to her hometown. I didn't care to know more than that. As for me, I found a small apartment in Asheville, tucked away in the mountains, where I could start fresh. I filled it with plants and books, things that made me happy. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Hindsight is 20/20, they say. Looking back, I see all the little moments that led to this. The cracks that had been forming long before Maria came into the picture, but I don't dwell on them anymore. This isn't a story about heartbreak. It's a story about rediscovery. And as I sit on my tiny balcony, watching the sun dip below the mountains, I realize I'm not just surviving. I'm living. And that's the best ending I could have hoped for.